choosing contraceptive use and choosing traditional contraceptive use and choosing traditional methods not as a starting point to evolve to modern contraceptive usage, then it behooves us to understand what is going on there. And particularly so if we care about fertility reduction or about women's ability to meet their own reproductive goals and to determine what issues from their bodies. Some of us, I hope, care about both of these things. Why, for example, do some studies show that highly educated women, including those who live in urban areas, are more likely to use traditional methods of contraception than their less educated or rural counterparts? That flies in the logic of everything that we learn in graduate school. But is this not precisely the sort of conundrum that those of us who call ourselves population scientists should be trying to resolve? Well, today, we will join that road to improving the insufficient research that has been devoted to understanding the motivations for traditional contraceptive use. Today's session should help us improve our understanding of women's motivations and use of traditional methods to avoid pregnancy, and also of whether methods are used in transitioning to modern methods or as a replacement for modern methods because of structural or ideological barriers. It's these kinds of questions that led Team Up, the consortium that's led by the African Institute for Development Policy in partnership with researchers from Ghana, Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the UK, is conducting this fundamental study on improving the measures of contraceptive use. And it's also why Team Up has sponsored this session today. The goal is clearly to advance our understanding of the true prevalence of traditional contraceptive methods use and the logic behind that. With this in mind, I'd like to start our panel discussion by introducing our speakers for today. First, we will hear a paper that's led by Professor Sasindran Palakadavarth from the University of Portsmouth and Dr. Nuruddin Al-Hassan from the African Institute for Development Policy. This is a paper titled Nomenclature Nonsense, a qualitative exploration of contraceptive definition and classification by respondents from Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Then we will turn to a paper by Dr. Chelsea Polis. Her paper is titled The Use of Fertility Awareness-Based Methods for Pregnancy Prevention Among Ghanaian Women, a nationally representative cross-sectional study. After these stimulating presentations, we will have a discussion by Professor Ayaga Bawa, who's the director of the Regional Institute for Population Studies at the University of Ghana. We will turn over the conversation to you all, receive questions, and hopefully try to answer those questions. And then we will have some sort of a discussion wrap-up by Professor Nyovani Madise. At the end of the program, I will come back, wave goodbye to you all, and hopefully then we'd have had a satisfactory conversation that begins this conversation about traditional contraception. So that is my plan for today. I hope it meets your satisfaction. And with no further ado, I will turn over to the first paper. This, my understanding is led today by Nuruddin Al-Hassan. So Nuru?
Hello, and welcome to this special session. My name is Nuruddin Al-Hassan. I work as a research and policy analyst at the African Institute for Development Policy. In this presentation, I will be sharing with you preliminary findings from a qualitative study we conducted as part of the TMAP program. TMAP is a consortium that is implementing the project titled Re-examining Traditional Method Use, Desperation or Innovation. This project is led by AFIDEP in collaboration with several research institutions in Africa, as well as the University of Portsmouth. For a long time, several definitions labels have been devised by researchers, experts, and reproductive health practitioners to classify or label different contraceptive methods. The most common of these definitions or classifications is the categorization of contraceptive methods into traditional or modern methods. Whilst there's consensus in the classification of many contraceptive methods, there is disagreement in others. For instance, the Demographic and Health Survey classifies folkloric methods such as herbs, rings, the use of rings, charms, and amulets as traditional methods, while the WHO disagrees and does not recognize these methods as contraceptives at all. Even though several high-level technical meetings have been held to discuss the classification of these methods, few studies have examined the labels, definitions, and classification systems adopted by contraceptive users themselves, as well as local communities to distinguish between the various contraceptive methods. So one of the objectives of the pilot we conducted was to explore the nomenclature used by contraceptive users, as well as local communities in 4 African countries to define and classify contraceptive methods. And like I said earlier, the data is pilot data from the TMAP consortium, and the study is conducted in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So in Ghana, data collection, we conducted a pilot study in Accra and Kumasi in the Ashanti region. In Nigeria, we focused on 2 states, Lagos and Adamawa states. In Kenya, we focused on 2 counties, Makueni and Mombasa counties. And in DRC, our focus was on Kinshasa and Mai-Ndombe, but the data for DRC is only restricted to Kinshasa. The selection of these countries were informed both by the levels of contraceptive use and the complex mix of traditional and modern methods in the various sites. We mainly conducted focus group discussions and key informant interviews. And our focus group discussions were segregated mainly by age and marital status. So we had focus group discussions with young unmarried women, young married women, older unmarried women, and older married women. We also have focus groups with younger unmarried men and older married men. In the key informant interviews, we conducted interviews with community leaders, reproductive health nurses, traditional birth attendants, as well as other suppliers or people who served traditional contraception. We coded and analyzed the data, basically looking at the themes emerging from the data. I will be sharing with you some of the findings from this, our preliminary analysis. So generally, the participants, both the focus group discussion participants and the key informant interviews, classified the various contraceptive methods into 3 key groups. That is modern, traditional, and natural methods. This does not neatly fit into the traditional modern dichotomy that is often discussed in the literature. So they compared modern and traditional methods relative to natural methods, and they highlighted the similarity between modern and traditional methods in that modern and traditional method use both involve the use of substances that are either drunk, swallowed, inserted, applied topical or internally to the body, contrasted against natural methods that don't involve the use of any substance. In terms of the classification, the participants mainly classify contraceptive methods on the basis of 4 criteria. 1 had to do with contraceptives that had side effects versus those that had no side effects, contraceptives that were very effective in preventing pregnancy against those that were not very effective, contraceptives that were provided or supplied in health facilities against those that were supplied or administered at home, and then old methods against new methods. Even though these look like separate categories or criteria, there are very complex interlinkages between each of these criteria and within them, such that the discussion of one of the criteria links straightly with others and also shares features with some of the other criteria. If you look at the first criteria, which has to do with side effects against those without side effects, we give direct quotes from some of the FGDs as well as key informant interviews to illustrate these points. So this is an illustration from a focus group discussion in Kenya. The participant here is highlighting that for them, family planning drugs, people are saying they have side effects like cancer and stuff. So we are depending on this one for counting, that is rhythm. That is what we are depending a lot on. It really helps us because these drugs, it's like it has side effects. So the participant is mainly contrasting the side effects of modern contraceptives or methods such as injectables against the use of rhythm, which is not associated with any side effect. Also, we had the comparison of methods that are very effective in pregnancy prevention against those that are of doubtful efficacy. The quote here by one of the participants in Kenya again illustrates this point perfectly. So one of the participants, this is a 45-year-old woman who says, and I quote, "I am 45 years old. Between 35 and 40, you can still become pregnant. I do not want a child anymore, so I pick that which will be suitable for me, so I avoid getting pregnant. And from 40 years, you could be old and you tend to forget if you are using pills. So I say that tubal ligation in the group of tubal ligation is suitable for those who are 35 to 40 years old." So even though the respondent is talking about efficacy, they also point to the fact of the suitability of the method at the exact ages, women who are in their older ages. So she argues that such women are at a place where they could easily forget to take pills, but with a permanent method like tubal ligation, the possibility of getting pregnant, they don't desire children, the possibility of getting pregnant is almost limited to nothing. To continue, the comparison of the setting where these methods are provided, facility-based, that is in clinics, health facilities, against those that are provided at home or self-administered. Here, one of the participants in Ghana says this, and I quote, "For the modern method, your blood is tested at the hospital to know which one would be best for you. But for the traditional method, it's not prescribed by anyone. We just purchase them by ourselves and use them based on our own knowledge. We do the traditional methods ourselves, and the modern methods are the one you go to have a blood test at the hospital to know what is best for you." So here, the main distinction was the setting. But here again, the respondent is talking of issues of effectiveness and reliability of the test. Finally, we give an illustration of the distinction whether the method is old or new. Here, it is instructive to note that respondent did not just refer to old and new in terms of the time dimension. There is a point of time dimension, methods that were used a long time ago versus methods that were used now. But there is also the point about methods being known new to the community versus being old to the community. So even though some methods were generally considered as modern, the fact that the community only came to its realization and are using it now, they consider it as a new method. One FGD participants in Nigeria had this to say: "That pills are modern, and then the normal and family planning that the doctors, the hospitals, and your parents will tell you is the ancient stuff." So here, the participant is talking of ancient stuff against the methods that are provided by doctors at the facility. Now, the preliminary data from our pilot shows that respondents' definition of traditional contraceptives exclusively focused on folkloric methods such as the use of herbs, rings, charms, and amulets. Other methods that are often classified as traditional methods such as rhythm, withdrawal, are not included in the definitions offered by the participants. So the participants mainly focused on the use of folkloric methods and defined those ones as traditional methods. Now, with herbs, they also make the distinction that herbs have a dual function in terms of classification. And here, the definition of herbs included both their use as contraceptives and abortifacients. Respondents emphasized that the goal is to prevent a childbearing. So contraceptives, as we broadly define as substances, medical or sexual practices to prevent pregnancy. Here, the definition of contraception extends to include preventing childbearing, which includes removing a pregnancy. So they emphasize that these herbs are important because they could also prevent a pregnancy, they could prevent a childbearing even if pregnancy occurs. Now, the most dominant theme from the data was the classification by efficacy. And this is consistent with what experts, researchers, and policymakers generally use to classify methods. The respondents mainly talked about whether a method was effective or not. Both the participants in this study, as well as the literature and arguments proposed by experts, show that the setting where the contraceptive is provided is important when you are classifying methods. Generally, the classification systems available show that methods that are provided in the health facility are effective and much more reliable relative to those that are self-administered or provided at home. Now, one key classification criteria the participants relied on was whether the method or methods have side effects or not. Even though side effects of contraceptive methods is generally acknowledged, and there's a lot of research available on this, when it comes to the classification of methods, side effects is often not one of the major considerations. But here, the participant highlights side effects as an important factor to distinguish between methods. It's therefore important for us to consider side effects as a criteria in deciding which method belongs to what category. In conclusion, even though some of the classification systems adopted by the participants in this study are consistent with those available in the literature by experts, some of their definitions do not fit in, and these have implications for the measurements, for the development of measures or indicators for tracking the coverage of contraceptives. It is important for us to consider or revise the existing classification measures to include some of these things. For instance, the issue of including folkloric methods such as herbs as traditional contraception, and also considering side effects as an important factor when we are classifying contraceptive methods. We would like to acknowledge funding from the Gates Foundation for this project, our study participants, as well as Jamaica Coker and Lene, who have been very useful in providing feedback on our work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nuruddin. Thank you so much for that presentation. I think, as I indicated at the beginning, we probably should roll on to the second presentation now. And so I would like to invite Dr. Chelsea Polis to make her presentation.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be joining this excellent panel and grateful to my colleagues at AFADEP for convening it and for the opportunity to talk about an under-discussed topic. So I'll be presenting our work on fertility awareness-based methods, or what I'll call FABMs, for pregnancy prevention among Ghanaian women. And this work was done in close collaboration with my colleagues, Eastman Otapiri, Suzanne Bell, and Roderick Larson-Reindorf. Fertility awareness refers to a set of practices aimed at determining the fertile window, or the span of days during each menstrual cycle when the probability of conception is highest if unprotected vaginal sex occurs. Done correctly, this information can be used to monitor gynecological health, to attempt pregnancy, or to attempt to avoid pregnancy. And if this method is used for pregnancy avoidance on days believed to be fertile, people can either use barrier or other contraceptive methods or avoid penile vaginal intercourse. Multiple categories and types of FABMs exist, and I'll highlight just a few. The most widely known and used FABM is rhythm, which is a traditional method. But many people who report using rhythm are not using its formal rules, which involve a series of complex calculations. Some FABMs, like the standard days method and the 2-day method, are considered by WHO, USAID, and others to be modern methods, although these classifications aren't universal, and they're provided in family planning programs in some countries. 2 FABMs, natural cycles and clue birth control, are relatively newer, and in the United States, they've been cleared by the Food and Drug Administration as digital apps indicated for use as contraception. Research on FABMs in low and middle income countries has been limited. And without understanding people who choose these methods, we're hampered in identifying client-centered approaches to contraceptive counseling, programming, and method development, and from identifying approaches to enhance effectiveness of preferred methods while respecting contraceptive choice and autonomy. FABM use is underestimated in surveys, and this impedes accurate classification of users and estimation of other key metrics. So we aimed to estimate the prevalence of rhythm and standard days method use among Ghanaian contraceptors to understand factors associated with choosing an FABM versus choosing other methods, and to understand nuances around how Ghanaian women use FABMs, and to help identify ways to improve FABM measurement in surveys. So very briefly, we did a nationally representative community-based survey of Ghanaian women as part of a larger study on abortion. First, using probability to proportional to size sampling, we randomly selected 100 enumeration areas, each containing about 200 homes. In each enumeration area, we randomly selected 42 homes. And in these homes, we identified eligible women to participate in the full survey. So ultimately in 2018, we interviewed over 4,700 women aged 15 to 49, and we collected data on a range of topics, including questions specifically on rhythm and on FABMs. To identify current rhythm or standard days method users, we asked respondents, have you or a partner ever done something or used any method to delay or avoid getting pregnant? Respondents who said yes were asked to spontaneously list all the methods they'd ever used, and then we probed them on all other possible methods. Interviewers followed a similar process for current method use. So studies suggest that traditional or quote unquote natural methods are underreported, as some respondents interpret filtering questions as pertaining only to modern methods, and since probing on all methods is rarely done. So in our study, any woman who reported ever doing something or using any method to delay or avoid getting pregnant would have been alerted via probing that we consider rhythm and standard days method as doing something or using any method to avoid pregnancy. And they would have been probed on these methods if they didn't spontaneously mention them. However, we did have these filtering questions, so if respondents happen to answer no to both questions, we may have missed some users. So given this, we interpret our prevalence estimates as a lower bound. Method-specific prevalence is typically calculated based upon the most effective method reported. So for example, if a demographic and health survey respondent reports currently using both standard days method and condoms, she would be classified as a condom user. And this may underestimate FABM prevalence, as she might use condoms only during the fertile window, despite having sex with no condom on days that the FABM correctly or incorrectly identifies as infertile. So in addition to calculating prevalence in this standard way, we used an approach that we previously applied in the United States, which incorporates information on multiple method use. Respondents who report use of an FABM alone or with other methods were coded into 3 categories. The key difference is in row B in the table on this slide. Women who report currently using both an FABM and a barrier method or emergency contraception is coded as a likely FABM user. We found that 23% of women reporting rhythm and 28% of women reporting standard days method reported FABM use plus condoms or EC. So in other words, about a quarter of women who report using an FABM may rely primarily on an FABM, but are not counted as such in the standard way of estimating method prevalence. So taking this information into account, our rhythm use estimates among contraceptors increased from 9 to 12%. Standard days method use estimates increased from 4 to 6%, and any FABM use estimates increased from 13.5 to 18% of contraceptors. We assessed characteristics associated with FABM use versus use of hormonal contraception or IUDs. And after adjusting for all of the factors shown on this graph, older age, lower parity, greater wealth, and higher education were significantly associated with using FABMs over using hormonal methods or IUDs. Among rhythm users, 85% reported identifying their fertile and non-fertile days by counting days on a calendar, though we didn't ask which specific rules they employed. 17% used an unspecified approach, and 9% observed changes in cervical mucus. 5% or fewer reported app use, observing the position or texture of their cervix, recording daily temperature, or using cycle beads. Nearly 3/4 of rhythm users had ever heard of standard days method, while less than 1/4 had heard of other approaches to make FABMs more effective or easier to use, such as using cycle beads at 22%, or the cycle beads mobile app at 17%, other mobile phone apps for FABMs at 23%, or other simple to use FABMs like the 2-day method at 22%. Nearly all rhythm users expressed interest in learning how to make their use of rhythm more effective at pregnancy prevention. A majority of them would be willing to use approaches facilitated by a phone, 82%, or to record their daily temperature, 76%. Slightly over half, 53%, expressed a willingness to collect daily cervical mucus or to observe cervical texture by inserting their fingers into their vagina daily. Only half of rhythm users knew where to go for advice on using rhythm more effectively. Among those who knew, most, at 53%, would go to a family planning service provider. However, only 17% of rhythm users have ever discussed using the rhythm method with a health professional. When rhythm or standard days methods users were asked how they avoided pregnancy on days identified as fertile, 74% reported avoiding intercourse. The next most common answer was withdrawal at 19%, followed by using condoms or another barrier method, and then by using emergency contraception. Among FABM users who abstain on fertile days, 64% said it was very easy to get their partner to abstain on those days, while another 22% reported that it was somewhat easy. Among FABM users who use withdrawal during fertile days, 68% said it was very easy to get partners to withdraw, and another 10% said somewhat easy. I didn't have time, unfortunately, for a strengths and limitations slide, but we do go into depth on this in our paper, which I hope you might be interested in reading. So moving on to the discussion, we posit that at least 18% of contracepting women in Ghana definitely or likely relies on an FABM for pregnancy prevention. Had we relied on the standard approach to calculate this estimate, it would be 13.5%. Given our use of a filtering question, our 18% estimate may be a lower bound, and 18% represents more contraceptors in Ghana than already rely on oral contraceptive pills, and nearly as many as those who rely on 3 monthly injectables. On days correctly or incorrectly identified by the method or the user as infertile, these users who wish to avoid pregnancy may be having sex without contraception. This is something we've known for a while. What this study helps to point out is that FABM users may use complex multi-method strategies to avoid pregnancy on days identified as fertile, and that those patterns have implications not only for how FABM prevalence is calculated, but also for estimation of contraceptive effectiveness of certain methods and for the utility of terms that are commonly used in large surveys, such as periodic abstinence. This term implicitly assumes avoidance of sex on days identified as fertile. Our paper offers several specific suggestions to improve terminology in surveys like the demographic health surveys and others in hopes of helping to address some of these issues. Contraceptors who definitely or likely use FABMs appear to have several relatively advantaged characteristics in comparison with their counterparts using hormonal contraception or IUDs, such as being older, richer, and more educated. This may reflect distinct preferences for these methods, which has been identified in other studies in Ghana and elsewhere, or it may reflect that aspects of FABMs are less accessible to less advantaged women, such as the ability to negotiate the timing and circumstances of sex with a partner, which women in our sample did not report much difficulty with. 85% of rhythm users reported identifying fertile days with a calendar, though it remains unclear exactly what rules they use and how accurate those rules may be at correctly identifying the fertile window. Many such users are likely not using the formal rules of rhythm, and they may simply be avoiding unprotected sex on days when they believe, possibly inaccurately, that pregnancy is possible. Few rhythm users have heard of ways to make use of their method easier or more effective, and very few reported using tools like cycle beads or apps. Yet almost all rhythm users want to make their use of the method more effective, and a substantial proportion expressed willingness to collect additional fertility signs or to use apps. Since only 50% of FABM users knew where to get advice on using rhythm, and only 17% of rhythm users had ever discussed their method with a health professional, there seems to be a substantial missed opportunity to assist rhythm users in making their chosen method simpler and more effective. And researchers and family planning programs have a lot more to do to address these users' needs as part of our field's commitment to reproductive autonomy and choice. So I'd really like to thank all of you for listening today. Again, to my colleagues at AFADET for including us in this great panel, our funders, our truly amazing team shown here in this photograph, and all of the women who participated in the study. Thanks again, and I will look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. That was an interesting presentation from Dr. Chelsea Polis from the Guttmacher Institute. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Ayaga Bauer from the Regional Institute for Population Studies to give us a discussion of what he's heard so far. Ayaga?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Very loud and clear.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to the presenters for two very interesting presentations on a topic that is gaining a lot of interest in terms of its contribution to understanding the contribution of traditional method to the repertoire of method mix for family planning. Data from the most recent DHSs have shown that women are increasingly resorting to the use of traditional methods, particularly among those who are educated and also those who are in the high income brackets. The motivations for this are clearly not well understood, and there's the need for us to be able to try and investigate to understand why this is the case. But what is clear is that whatever the motivations are, this has implications for the method mix dynamics, and therefore calls for the need to pay attention to this issue, primarily for two reasons. First, that it's important to look at this because it helps us to understand the motivations behind the increasing use of, or the increasing interest among women to use traditional methods. And two, it also provides us with insights on how to better capture data to improve the measurement of traditional methods, which we know have traditionally not been adequately captured in the way we traditionally collect these data. So it is on this score that these two papers are particularly important and for this audience and for the family planning community. So let me turn to the papers themselves. The paper by Nuruddin and colleagues aim to better understand the classification and definitions women give to these methods. They identify four classifications based on side effects versus no side effects, those based on whether the method is efficacious or not efficacious, methods that are provided in health facilities or not at health facilities, and finally, methods that are considered to either be old or new. Whilst these classifications seem to be seem to look exclusive in their own rights, it's important to understand that sometimes the differences between these classifications are very, very blurred, and there are complex interlinkages that are found in how these classifications are linked in ways that sometimes it's very difficult to disentangle them. And we have seen that in the discussion that has been provided by Nuruddin and his colleagues in the paper that they presented this afternoon. The second paper focused on women's understanding of what they call FABM methods in Ghana. The paper, the methods were classified into what you call calendar-based methods, cervical mucus-based methods, temperature-based methods, cervical hormonal-based methods, and then symptothermal methods, among others. Now, to improve the measurement of these methods, the researchers employed the multi-model use approach. And clearly, as we saw in the results show that there have been improvements in the capturing of these methods as opposed to the way traditionally the data has been collected in the DHS. The paper then went on to examine the characteristics of women who use these methods and clearly show that women are selected on the basis of education. So you see that women who are better educated tend to use these methods, women in the high socioeconomic categories, older women, and women with fewer children. So these are a select group of women, and we have to try to understand why you have this select group of women who tend to prefer to use these kinds of methods. Now, if you take the two papers together, what they show is that they have demonstrated that to be able to adequately capture the use of this method requires a nuanced and innovative ways to be able to collect data in order to be able to isolate and capture these methods adequately. Secondly, the papers show that there are important quality implications, especially for how data on contraceptive use has traditionally been captured. And so there's the need for us to rethink about how data on these methods are collected, especially in the DHS and other surveys, nationally or local surveys that are based on that are used to collect data on contraceptive use. And so, given that in mind, it's important that programs such as the DHS begin to look at it, and it is gratifying to know that the DHS has already started to pilot in some selected countries how to better capture these kinds of data. I'm part of a group convened by colleagues from PRB who have been discussing this issue and have been looking at some of the questions that have been introduced in some of the selected countries to be able to capture these kinds of data. So finally, I would say that there's the need, if we want to be able to actually better isolate these methods and to be able to adequately capture how many women are using these methods, it's important that funders invest in research to help us to better characterize and understand these methods and provide women with more information on these methods to improve their effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bauer. Thank you, Professor Bauer. So we're at the point now, we're running a bit ahead of schedule, but that's always useful. That's always useful because I think it gives more time to the audience to participate by asking questions and suggesting ways in which the work might go forward. So at this point, let me invite Dr. Nadodua Dodu Ajokache and Dr. Mami Peterson to help moderate what I am hoping will be a very stimulating discussion. Na?
Yes, we are here. Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you very much, Rudin, Chelsea, Ayaga, for those very thought-provoking submissions. I think we will first open up to questions on the floor amongst the audience. So if anyone has, whether it's a question, something, a theme for discussion, a contribution, you can just raise up your hand and then we will have you speak. Or you can type in your question or your contribution in the chat box and then we can start with that. Okay, I see one hand already up. Jacques Emina. Yes, Jacques.
Yeah, thank you to the team. Thank you, Nuruddin, Francis, Bauer. Yeah, I have a question, and I don't know whether it's really a question or a comment. I'm asking myself whether some methods are actually methods by per se themselves. Let me give example of the temperature or the calendar base. So that method should be method only if it's associated with abstinence or withdrawal. So what should we consider as a method? So that is my question, because calendar base should be combined with something else. Could be a condom, could be abstinence or withdrawal, most of those methods. So this is my point.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I think I'll throw it to the panel or to anyone who wants to contribute to it. We want this to be a discussion amongst all of us as much as possible, rather than just having the panel members speak. So is there anyone who wants to respond to this or move this question forward?
Hi, I'm happy to take a crack at it. And Mr. Amina, if I've misunderstood your question, please correct me. I think you're asking if, and I don't know if you were specifically focused on fertility awareness-based methods. I think those were the examples that you gave, but if they should be considered a method if they're practiced in conjunction with abstinence. Am I understanding correctly?
No, sorry. My question is that some of those methods, we cannot use it alone. Let's say the calendar method, you know the period, but it's not the method itself. To be really a method, you have to combine it with abstinence. So the abstinence is based on something. And then you have a withdrawal is based also on something. So you have to combine two of them to have a method. I don't know whether it's clear. Maybe the language is a problem for me, but I don't know, because you cannot say standard day. Okay, it's standard day. What are you doing from that day? Whether you don't have sex that day, or you are going to use condom, or you are going to apply a withdrawal. So standard day is a reference, but it's not really a method. You have to combine with something to have an effective method.
I think I understand your question, and I'm happy to take a crack, and I'm really interested in what other people have to say as well. I mean, I think if we think in a broad sense about the ways in which people avoid unintended pregnancy, it involves behaviors, and it in some cases will involve products, devices, all sorts of things. If you think about the method of abstinence, the implication there is that somebody is abstaining from sex as their method over time. And I think the difference with some of the fertility awareness-based methods that you mentioned, including standard days and others, is that there's more of a cyclical function to that. And so abstinence is being practiced specifically within that fertile window, or what's believed to be the fertile window according to the method or the user. But then during the days that are considered infertile by the method or the user, accurately or inaccurately, then it is possible that those users are having sex without any form of contraception. Yes. And so if they have incorrectly identified an infertile day, they would be at risk of unintended pregnancy. So I think, with total abstinence, although that is a very hard to achieve perfect use of abstinence, there would not, in theory, be risk of unintended pregnancy with these methods. I think because of the more cyclical nature of intercourse, it is a separate category. I don't know if that gets to your question, and I'm eager for other people's thoughts as well.
Yeah.
Yes, Chelsea, I think you got. Yes, you got it. Does anyone else want to speak to it? Okay, Nuruddin's hand is up. And then we have a question in the chat box. Yes, Nuruddin.
Yes, thank you so much, Jack, for that question. I think it's a good question, but if you look at the issues we have been dealing with, it comes back to, in reality, what we often consider as methods, we expect that people go and use just one method, a condom or abstain. But in reality, what people are doing to prevent pregnancy is much more complex. So even though you need to use a calendar method with withdrawal, a condom, or any other method, it's important to also capture the calendar method as one of the devices or ways people use to capture this whole complex process of preventing pregnancy. So it will be difficult for you to see that this is a method because it is that one that is directly involved in the pregnancy prevention itself, but all the other devices and sexual practices and behaviors that are associated with that complex process should be omitted. So I would say that yes, it should be, calendar methods should be classified as methods in their right because they are part of the complex process of pregnancy prevention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nuruddin. Any other submission to contribute to that? Okay, but anyway, I think that Jack has made his point that at the end of the day, most people who use these sexual awareness-based methods need to combine it with something else for it to be really effective. And maybe we are missing out on getting them to know what they should combine it with that will make it effective. Okay, so there's a question from Anne Biddlecombe in the chat box, and I'll read it out. And she says it's a question to both panel members and audience. Moving beyond the classification of methods, what are promising levers to pursue to support traditional method users towards more effective pregnancy prevention, either better use of traditional methods they are using or transitioning to a more appropriate method? Maybe I should take it again. So she says that moving beyond classification of methods, what are promising levers to pursue to support traditional methods users towards more effective pregnancy prevention, that is either better use of traditional methods they are using or transitioning to a more appropriate method? That's a really big question. I wonder what our thoughts are. Yes, Giovanni wants to contribute. Let me turn to that.
Sorry for the musical chairs. But I was intrigued by what you said, Chelsea, about women wanting the fertility awareness-based methods to be more effective. And I was also intrigued by the large number or large proportion of women who actually say they would like to get more information from the family planning providers. And it takes me back to years, and Anne Biddlecombe will remember this, when we did a study with adolescents and protecting the next generation against HIV, but some of the questions we were asking were about information on SRHR and who the preferred sources of information were. And it's always intrigued me that even the adolescents actually preferred to hear from the health providers. So Chelsea, what you're finding is similar. And I wonder whether we need to actually be looking at ways of encouraging the more formal family planning provision scenario to be more accommodating and more provide more information. And I think to provide the unbiased evidence and information about what you can do if your choice is to use a calendar method, or if you want to use the withdrawal, what the choices are, perhaps more during the period when you're most likely to be fertile, to use dual methods or things like that. So I wonder whether that's one way forward.
Thank you very much, Giovanni. Is there someone who wants to speak to that as well? Okay, Chelsea's hand is up. Nurudin, is this your hand up from the last time, or is it?
No, I'm trying to respond to Anne's question.
Okay,
Yes.
Then since your mic is already unmuted, please respond and then we'll take Chelsea's view on it.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a very good question by Anne. I think from the pilot we conducted in our study countries, I think there are opportunities for us to be able to work to transition traditional method users to other effective methods. In a number of the traditional method users we talked to in the key informant interviews, what was clear was the role of their partners. In fact, a number of them, the traditional method, that is withdrawal or the use of rhythm or any of the fertility awareness-based method, was initiated by their sexual partner. So because there is discussion with the sexual partner, they believe it's easy to implement, and you can see similar in Chelsea's findings. So once you have partners discussing this, it's easy for you to talk to those partners about transitioning to something else. But what we need to do is to be open about discussing the side effects or perceived side effects of other methods. Because what keeps people in using traditional methods is a perception that these things really have side effects that can severely affect their reproductive lifestyle. The second is introducing traditional methods as part of the methods that are available in health facilities, not in terms of supplying, but the information. If people can get this information at the health facility and they can discuss with them openly with the health providers, it's also another way of bringing such people into the formal health system and then transitioning them gradually into the use of other more effective methods. That's what I can say to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nurudin. Yes, Chelsea.
Thanks, Nan. And I think it's such a great question, and also really support what Dr. Alhassan shared. Just to add a couple of other points on top of that, I think certainly the points about improved counseling, there's plenty of room for improvement in terms of ensuring that women are aware of, or users, all people are aware of all of their options. And particularly when it comes to, and I'll focus on FABMs because that's what our paper focused on. When it comes to FABMs, knowledge is incredibly low, even in our study, even among people who were using a fertility awareness-based method, only 50% knew that the fertile window was approximately between two periods, which is itself a very rough measure of understanding the cyclical nature of fecundability. So I think there's a lot of room for improved counseling about the existence and this correct use of these methods. We know that for rhythm users, and this is true around the world, here in where I'm based in the United States, as well as many other places, that the way that people use the word rhythm is pretty loosely defined. That somebody might consider themselves a rhythm user, but not be actually using the fairly complicated calculation requirements that define the formal rhythm method, which involve tracking back your last 6 menstrual cycles and doing a series of calculations, which is pretty complex. And so that we know people who even consider themselves using rhythm might just be basing it on kind of factors that haven't necessarily been studied for effectiveness. So I think reaching out to people who are using those methods and identifying ways to help them understand that if this is the method that they choose and that they prefer, there could be ways to help improve the effectiveness of that. And expanding beyond that, understanding fertility and reproductive biology in a broader sense, I think is also important. Understanding age-related fertility decline could better help people meet their reproductive health goals writ large by impressing upon people the fact that age-related fertility decline is real, and that understanding biomarkers of fertility can also help people to achieve pregnancy when they want to do that. So that's one other point that I wanted to add. And I think, again, going back to some of the levers, one other area where, you know, with this method and this category of method and others, there's opportunity is really with technology. There are currently 2 fertility awareness-based methods that are, as I mentioned in the presentation, cleared by the Food and Drug Administration for use as a contraceptive method. We saw in the results that I presented that many of the Ghanaian women that we surveyed would be interested in using a phone to make use of these methods simpler and hopefully more effective. And that's something that I think there's a lot of room to explore, in addition to exploring whether collecting additional biomarkers could be facilitated by use of hopefully simple but and accessible technologies, but that could make use of these methods more effective. So I'll stop there. I think I've gone on a bit.
Okay, thank you so much, Chelsea. I actually want to add a little bit to what you both said. I absolutely agree about us using these as a lever for even getting more males involved. Because, you know, for a traditional method, it really is about 2 people, or most traditional methods, or fertility awareness-based methods, need the cooperation of the partner. And we've been complaining so much about a lack of male involvement in family planning and all that. And so I think that is a stepping stone that we can use to get more males involved in family planning. But also to add to what Chelsea said about the people not knowing their fertile window. That's also something that we need to work with the health system, the education system, I don't know where, just to even educate people. So I teach a master's class on reproductive health, and it's really amazing. Every single year, one of the things that I explain, one of the first weeks of the course, it's even the whole menstrual cycle. And people at that level usually don't know. It's usually about 10% of the class who even know anything about how to even look at your cycle and where you are fertile or not fertile. So we do have a need for that. Now, finally, it's also about our health systems themselves, not even recognizing these fertility awareness-based methods in many instances. So I don't know, maybe Ba will know a little bit more about the Ghana health system. But I've spoken to people from the family planning directorate who say that they don't recognize rhythm, withdrawal, definitely. I don't know about other fertility awareness-based methods. And so they don't track people who use them. They don't even educate the health workers about them, so that if someone like these women who say that we want to know more about it, if they ask, even these health workers don't know that much about them to teach. So perhaps that's also another thing that we can use, because if someone comes to ask about using rhythm more effectively, that health worker can say, okay, so rhythm, this is how you would use it, but you can also do this, which would be even more effective, and that's also getting a step into more people using more effective methods. Okay, thank you. I've also spoken a lot. Okay, is there any? Yes, Jamaica. Jamaica's hand is up. Please jump in, Jamaica.
Thank you, Na. And I was going to respond to Anne's question as well, which I think is a great one, and I can see a little back and forth happening as I speak. I was going to take this actually just to a higher level, and I think I am very much preaching to the choir here. But you know, one promising lever is increased evidence and increased conversations about traditional methods. I think that the international family planning community is still largely uncomfortable with traditional methods in terms of how to define them and where they fit, and I think not entirely unjustified. You know, when you think about effectiveness and information, misinformation, as Dr. Polis pointed out, with understanding a method that one is using, and so we don't know as a field how to treat them, and there are very different views for that. I think we have some very important opposition and just not enough information. And if we talk about meeting women's needs and meeting women where they are, understanding their preferences, having a clear understanding of what that looks like from the user's perspective, I think is going to play an important role in how funders, implementers, international organizations are able to understand and then better account for traditional methods. So I do think that, you know, we want to be clear about the effectiveness, both the potential and the the actual rates when used. But the more that we can understand and articulate, but not just as a monolith, but the different reasons for different preferences. In some cases, it's an actual preference, in others, I think, Anne, maybe not more appropriate, but yeah, more appropriate from the user's perspective and situation, the better that we equipped some of the decision makers who, for better or for worse, make decisions that impact the field globally, the more that we can make sure that the traditional methods are incorporated as a part of that conversation. I think we're getting much closer, and all this session, the research that's been presented and other conversations are really elevating a look at, where traditional methods fit in the sort of spectrum of choice and preference, and continuing to, I think, to really ride the momentum that seems to be building to really understand that, and making sure that they have a place in the broader family planning agenda, and that it's more clearly defined in the coming years.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Rebecca. Okay, I don't know whether there's anyone else who has a question or a contribution to make? Anyone in the audience? Okay, I don't see. So here was, okay, so Mami, will you take one of our questions from inside our boardroom here? Okay. So we have a couple of questions that we also wanted to discuss to enrich this whole discussion. So to our panelists, as well as to everyone else here on the platform, we ask, why should we study traditional methods used at all, given that they are not as effective as modern methods? Is it to target traditional method users so they will use modern methods, or is it to encourage traditional method users to use them more effectively? So why should we study traditional methods at all? This is open to our panelists and then to the rest of our audience. Please feel free to jump in.
It might help if you basically sort of spelled out all the questions from the boardroom, and then maybe some of them sort of interact with each other, and it might be useful to have a discussion of all of them at the same time instead of going sequentially.
Okay, thank you, Prof. So our second question is, what are the implications of being able to capture traditional method use more accurately or comprehensively for large-scale surveys, such as the DHS, the mix, PMA, and also for programmatic planning? I can repeat that. What are the implications of being able to capture traditional method use more accurately or comprehensively for large-scale surveys, such as the DHS, the mix, the PMA, and for programmatic planning? Then also, what are the implications of different classification models of traditional methods? So for example, classifying lactational and amenorrhea method, folkloric methods as traditional methods or not, or the determination of contraceptive prevalence rates, and eventually for fertility management. So what are the implications of the different classification models that we have for traditional methods? As you know, the DHS, for instance, has been classifying traditional methods differently over time. So for instance, from the first model to the current model, which is the model 8, which is the model 8, initially folkloric methods and LAM were considered as traditional, but now LAM is considered as a modern method. So here we ask what the implications are for the different classifications, even for contraceptive prevalence rates, assessments or estimates. And then finally, we ask, where does male involvement come into the discussion of traditional method use? So for example, are there opportunities to take advantage of for involving men more in family planning if their partners are using traditional methods that require partner cooperation? For example, with withdrawal and with ribbing. How different, for example, is a woman who can use modern methods clandestinely from one who uses traditional methods with her partner's support, how can we leverage on these for reaching men? These are the questions that we want to discuss, in addition to the ones that we've already discussed. So open to our panelists in the audience, please feel free to jump in. Thank you, Mami. Yes, Chelsea.
I'm happy to jump in, but I'm really hoping that others will chime in as well. I'm eager to hear people's thoughts on these great questions. I'll just tackle the first one that you mentioned in terms of why we should study traditional methods, given that they're not as effective. And is this really to target traditional method users so that they'll use modern methods, or to encourage traditional method users to use them more effectively? My answer to that is I think we should study traditional method users for the same reasons that we study users of all other contraceptive methods. It's, to understand what their desires are, what their challenges are, and to understand how we can better meet their needs, and really focusing on the user's own articulation of what their needs and values and lifestyle preferences and all of those things are. We know that women and people using traditional methods are taking action to avoid conceiving. And we also know, to the point that Jamaica was raising earlier around effectiveness, that these users in many cases may be more vulnerable to unintended pregnancy compared with users of other contraceptive methods. There's a little bit of fuzziness around comparison of effectiveness rates for certain FABMs. There's limited evidence. We have a systematic review on this that I'd be happy to share with anybody who's interested in the nitty-gritty details. But by and large, with traditional method use, there's generally going to be lower effectiveness, and we need to consider how we can better assist people who have expressed an interest in those methods in better achieving their specific goals while respecting their preferences and their choices, while bearing in mind that contraceptive effectiveness is one key reason why people choose given methods, but there's also so many other factors that go into that. Safety, side effects, impacts on bleeding patterns, costs, protection from sexually transmitted infections, privacy, all of a whole range of other characteristics. So in my view, the goal shouldn't be getting people on the most effective method that exists and that's out there in the world, but rather helping people identify and access the most effective contraceptive method that fits within their desires, preferences, values, and lifestyle choices. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Chelsea. Ayaga Bauer's hand is up, and I think Sasindran wanted to make a contribution. So we'll take you, Bauer.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll take the question on implications of being able to better capture traditional methods. I mean, clearly, one of the reasons why traditional methods are often not preferred by program managers is because they believe that they are not as effective as modern methods. And if that is the case, then it's important that we are able to adequately capture them so that we are able to determine the number of women who are actually on this method, so that we are able to provide proper interventions to help make them much more effective or safer to use, as the case may be. So that's one of the implications I could immediately think of. Of course, when you talk about male involvement, you are all aware that withdrawal is one of the methods that, if you don't have the partner involved, you may have incurred the wrath of the male partner, and so it's important that you get the male partner involved and to come along with you. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I couldn't find the hand to raise, so I thought I would unmute so that you will identify. Thank you. Both the presentations were excellent. I think the question that you raised for discussion, why we should actually collect information about traditional method. I think one of the key reasons behind is calculating unmet need for contraception. So people may be using a number of traditional methods, and you wrongly calculate them being in need. Actually, they are actually using a method. So that's one area that I think, apart from other reasons that other panelists and discussant has raised. The other issue that I want to flag here is we talked a lot about classification of methods. I think one of the things coming to my mind always when we talk about classification is, what is the purpose of this classification? Why do we want to classify? Whether we want to classify in order to include a method to a national program, or do we want to expand the existing methods, or we want to provide more effective contraception to users? So I think a lot depends on what is the objective of making this classification that we are talking about. I think the user's perspective that is coming out from our research is very, very important in order to increase access to effective methods to women in general. So I think these are the two things that I thought very important. And I think the bigger picture that we tend to forget is that in today's DHS and other surveys do not capture all the methods. So I don't call it as a traditional method, but we still are with a handful of methods where I believe there will be hundreds of them. So how to navigate to that territory is another area that perhaps need much more wisdom. And I believe that the project we are involving currently would come up with some kind of insight to those issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sasi. Thank you. Just before we move on to the last set of contributions, Chelsea has put two things in the chat box. So one is the link to the systematic review that she mentioned on effectiveness of fertility awareness-based methods. And then she says there's a fun interactive infographic that summarizes all the information in the dense systematic review and compares them to modern methods. So please go to the chat box and you can copy those and engage with them later on. Thank you for sharing, Chelsea. Okay, so I see Bauer's hand is up and Nuruddin's hand was up. I'll take Nuruddin first. His hand was actually up earlier, and then we'll take Bauer.
No, actually, I think it's a legacy hand. So
okay, okay. So Nuruddin.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. For me, I just wanted to emphasize that why the need to study traditional methods. Normally, the way we discuss traditional methods, both in our measurements and in the literature, it sounds like there are just 10 women across the world who are using these methods. I checked the UN report on contraceptive method choice. And if you look at just the users of withdrawal and rhythm, I think so, you have 76 million users, which is equivalent to the users of injectables and much more than the users of implants. So the numbers, we have to study traditional methods in their own right as methods, recognizing that even with all the noise we make about not measuring them effectively or not capturing users as well as we could have, there are still more users there that we need to understand what is happening. And if you also look at some of the methods that are used in these traditional methods, it's much more complex to use them than some of the modern methods, but women still go through this process to use them. So the question is, why will somebody opt to use a method that involves drinking a concoction or drinking something that could be harmful to them when they could just get a pill. So there is a lot to learn from these women to understand the motivation, so that when we are moving to study other methods, we usually be okay, we are studying them because we want to move them to modern methods. There are some who would decide that no, thank you, we are not moving to any modern methods. You need to understand our motivation. You need to understand why we are using these methods as methods in their own right. Thank you.
So much, Nurdin. Okay, is there someone who wants to make, yes, Jamaica's hand is up. We'll take Jamaica and then I'll hand over back to the chair.
Thank you again. Just a quick input on the question of male involvement. I wanted to note, we don't have either of the co-PIs here, but there is a project currently underway through the Ohio State University, the co-PIs of Casterline and Ipitoye, who are looking at fertility preferences in Nigeria and doing couples interviews. And this is very preliminary findings, and so I don't want to talk about too many specifics, but one thing that had jumped out in their couples interviews in particular was the mention of traditional methods. And in a couple situations where the male partner had insisted they were not using family planning because he did not agree with it, but he also said that they were using withdrawal. And so I thought it was really interesting. We often think of these traditional methods as requiring more male involvement and that being a barrier. But this was a very different perspective. And I think, you know, as with most of the work that we're doing, it really is from the woman's perspective. But there may be more complicating factors in terms of how traditional methods are understood from men, and further research, further consideration of that might help us understand how to better involve men, more generally speaking, but certainly with traditional method use. And there'll be more coming on that. Again, I am speaking sort of, this is a bit of hearsay on their preliminary findings, but I think it's very interesting and has implications for how we look at the male involvement and male perceptions of traditional method use moving forward.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Jamaica. Okay, so I'll hand over back to Francis.
Thank you, Na and Mami. This was and thank you, Jamaica. This was quite an interesting segue to handing over back to me. I've been working and arguing and advocating for male involvement for over 3 decades. And it's interesting to hear the increasing warmth with which this is accepted. But I had some thoughts on some of the questions that have been asked, some of the responses that have been given. But I've also learned over the years that life goes on and goes on much, much, much better when I'm sitting quietly. And so I didn't want to interject while everybody was talking. And that was a really, really sort of a hearty conversation that we had. I mean, I think, so if I were to make the first point, it would be that one of my concerns is that we've been trying to understand and perhaps influence contraceptive behavior and fertility directions in sub-Saharan Africa going on, perhaps 3/4 of a century. It happens to be the continent that we've been least successful in doing these two things, the two things being understanding behavior and why people do what they do, and also influencing both contraceptive use and fertility trends. And I think part of the reason is that we haven't listened as well as we should to what the quote unquote subjects of the research, the people whose lives we're interested in improving, have to say about this. And for me, this has been one of the attractiveness of this project that I happen to be associated with. And I think Jamaica was right when she talked about the importance of conversations, the importance of conversations such as the one we're having today. I would argue that it would be even more beneficial to have these kinds of conversations before projects, to basically have these kinds of conversations be the route from which projects sort of emanate. And I know that consortia try to do that. I know that the consortium that has produced the ongoing project has tried to do that, but it would be even more useful if we could have a lot richer conversation before we even sort of proceed in directions that collect data. So that's sort of the first general point that I wanted to make. A second point that I heard, or I distilled from the conversation that we had, or that I was sort of listening to very intently, was this question about whether people's goal is to avoid pregnancy or to avoid fertility. And I would argue that those who want to avoid pregnancy also want to avoid fertility. But I would say strongly that I think there are people whose bigger concern is about avoiding fertility and may not mind as much about the pregnancy part of it. Indeed, I would argue that there are some people who need to verify and confirm for themselves pretty regularly during their reproductive life cycles that they still can get pregnant. So I think as we sort of sketch out ways in which we go to interrogate whether people are using contraceptive methods or want to use contraceptive methods to prevent pregnancy and so on and so forth, we have to be aware about this distinction between getting pregnant and being pregnant and having children, which isn't necessarily sort of inconsistent with one with the other. And I think the final point that I wanted to sort of share or put on the table is this notion that even the terminology we use matters. And so we've talked today about how certain methods are sometimes called traditional and sometimes called modern and so on and so forth. And I would go further to argue that even the weight of the moniker traditional can be burdensome in the sense that what it signals to respondents in the field, the people whose lives we're trying to augment, what it might signal to them is the fact that they are out of fashion or not hip if they use traditional methods. And so given what we've talked about, the confusions in the terminologies, the confusions in the classifications, perhaps this is a time where we need to start thinking about getting more robust, more valid monikers for these various types of methodologies. So that's really what I wanted to add to the conversation, but it obviously can't close on such a dour note. And so I will invite Professor Giovanni Madise to hopefully take us out of here on a more elevating note. So Giovanni?
That's a tall order, elevating note. Thank you so much, Francis. And thank you everyone who's participated. For me, it's really just to give a vote of thanks to those who've attended this session, to the presenters and to the discussant, Professor Yagabauer, and also to Professor Dodo for chairing. I just wanted to make a plug-in for Team Up, the project that Na and also Francis mentioned, that it's a year into the project where we've been doing some methodological piloting. Our aim is to expand upon Chelsea's work, where she worked in Ghana, looked at ways of measuring. She was focusing on the fertility awareness-based methods, but we're looking broader. So, and we're looking in 4 countries, but we're also mostly interested in not just measuring the prevalence, we are also interested in understanding the motivations for using such methods. We're also interested in that, interesting situation. Chelsea mentioned it, Nuru mentioned it, Francis mentioned it, where there is concurrent use of methods. And as we have heard, DHS in that situation would choose just the most efficacious method, but not fully understanding why, for example, a woman would use condoms with one partner and then use a traditional method with another, or indeed for the same partner, use condoms and traditional methods. We hope to understand that by using both surveys as well as qualitative research. We also plan to interview men so we can get a bit more understanding on these issues. So we do invite you to join us on this journey. Anyone who has participated from Affidavit, Nuruddin, myself, including our partners from Francis Dodo and also Seshindran, they are all part of the project. And if you do need to contact us, you can, or indeed just go to look at the organizer's address. We'll be very delighted to hear from you to help us on this journey. I just wanted us to go away with just 3 things. One is that Chelsea talked about a revised estimate for the prevalence of traditional traditional methods in Ghana, and she put it at 13% after looking at the concurrent use. I just wanted to say that actually 13% is a large number of women when you have large populations. Even when we start talking about 8% or 5% in a country with hundreds of 100 million people or more, that's a large number of women. So that's one point. The second point that I thought we should reflect on is the fact that when we have concurrent use, especially women using, for example, a pill, but then also using traditional methods or indeed the condoms or other modern methods and traditional methods, that does suggest that it's not lack of knowledge. The use of the traditional methods is not necessarily lack of knowledge. And indeed, the research that Chelsea has highlighted, and indeed other research, our own reviews, they do suggest that we're seeing more educated women, richer women, who are preferring to use traditional methods. And we do need to understand that a little bit better. And we do need to see ways of supporting women who are in this situation, who have, in many cases, chosen to use these methods and not necessarily completely rely on modern methods. My final point is that we do need to also understand what's happening with the COVID vaccine. And for me, the COVID vaccine is teaching me a lot about human behavior. And the fact is that we do have some of the deniers of vaccines are not the uneducated, rural and less knowledgeable people about maybe how viruses work, etc. We do have amongst the deniers very well-educated, informed people. And we need to reflect on that when we think about transitioning women from traditional to modern methods, that it may not always work like that. And we need to meet couples and women at their point of need. I would like to end there. So I've posed them as questions, not really provided answers or forward going, but we hope that this conversation will continue and that over time we can begin to unpack, and then by the time maybe we are in the third year of the project, we will have some more definitive answers on some of these questions, as well as how we need to categorize traditional versus modern methods, a better understanding of who is using, why they are using, and how we can indeed support them to be more effective in the method of their choice. So I'll stop there, and thank you so much, Francis, for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Novani. And after that, who can say anything? Thank you all, and it's been wonderful sharing this time with you. I wish you all a very wonderful rest of your mornings, afternoons, or evenings, wherever you are, and we will see you again soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you all.
Thank you. Goodbye.